for giving way, and may I too add my name to congratulate her on this debate today. Does she not agree with me that it is surprising, but rather wonderful actually, that the Republic of Ireland is actually leading the way on this, and indeed also on gay marriage? And does she agree with me that, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, Northern Ireland is devolved, they should look now to the south and say they are leading the way and we should follow?
I would like to join with my colleague. I hope he was also as supportive as I was of the wonderful work that the member for St Helens did on equal marriage and bringing the case for equal marriage in Northern Ireland, a case I wholeheartedly support, and I hope the government will too. Because devolution, even when it's functioning, does not relieve this place of our responsibility to uphold human rights, whether in Northern Ireland or elsewhere. I'll give 1 minute when I'll make some progress.
Thank you. Well, the Honourable Lady would know that I would respect devolution as a Welsh MP more than most, having to live it every day of my life. But this issue, and that of equal marriage in Northern Ireland, deserves to be tackled in the here and the now, and not use devolution as an excuse to deny the women of the right of abortion and to prevent equal marriage. This is 2018. Both of these issues are contemporary. They're about equality and they're about basic human rights.
As ever, I agree completely with my Welsh comrade. Mr Speaker, this outdated legislation is not just having an impact in Northern Ireland, and that's why this is a matter for the whole of this House. Because women across England and Wales are also buying pills online rather than seeking repeated visits to doctors. One study alone showed that in one 4-month period last year, 500 British women attempted to access abortion pills from one online supplier alone, and so would be liable to prosecution under this archaic rule as a result. This situation, then, is not simply about Northern Ireland. It's about legislation this House has passed and why this House must act. But I want to be very specific today in what I am proposing, because I understand there are concerns about this issue. Of course I will give way.
I'm very grateful indeed to the Honourable Lady, and this is of course a very, very sensitive and controversial issue, particularly in Northern Ireland. I need to reflect to the Honourable Lady that I have received a large number of emails from constituents who feel that MPs at Westminster are usurping the powers and the responsibilities of the Northern Ireland Assembly during a period when we haven't had a functioning Assembly, and I wish we did have one, and I'm looking to my colleagues here on the bench to urge them to have the Assembly up and running again. How can the Honourable Lady reassure my constituents that today's debate, an important debate, a very important debate, does not undermine the devolution settlement in Northern Ireland?
I thank the Honourable Friend for that question and absolutely wish to take up the challenge that she presents, because I completely respect the point of view that she's putting forward. Let me therefore make some progress and set out precisely what it is we are putting forward. The Offences Against the Person Act 1861 puts abortion in the same category as homicide, destroying or damaging a building with the use of gunpowder with the intent to murder, child stealing, rape or defilement of women. Abortion might be the most common procedure that our constituents who are women of reproductive age undergo, but even today in 2018 we don't let them make the choice themselves to have that procedure. So what we would like to do is repeal sections 58 and 59 of OPA. But letting sections 58 and 59 stay on the statute does not address many of the challenges that we see today in abortion provision. For example, extending the 1967 Act does not address the impact of the pills I discussed, or indeed that paternalism that says that women are not trusted to make choices about their bodies. But in repealing those particular sections of OPA, I also want to be clear what we're not doing. This is not an attempt to remove the criminal charges that come after 24 weeks. Let me make that explicitly clear, because I have seen some briefings from some anti-choice organisations that suggest otherwise. We are not intending to amend the Infant Life Preservation Act 1929 that covers and still has the power to criminalise abortions after 24 weeks of pregnancy. Decriminalising abortion up to 24 weeks of pregnancy would mean that the 1967 Abortion Act would become redundant before 24 weeks of pregnancy. As abortion before 24 weeks of pregnancy would no longer be a crime, you would no longer need the 1967 Act to act as a defence to women who had sought an abortion. However, the exemptions that the 1967 Act provides for terminations post 24 weeks would remain, And the 1967 Act would provide exemptions to prosecutions under the Infant Life Preservation Act, for example, in cases of severe fetal abnormality or where the mother's life is at risk. That might seem complicated. Let me put it as simply as possible. The time limit would not change, nor would the important role of medics in this matter. Now, I respect and recognise that some people do not consider abortion a human right, and so think a criminal approach is the right response. But I recognise many more agree it is not that worries them, but the constitutional issues that are at stake. Even though the Good Friday Agreement explicitly retained human rights responsibilities for this place, let me reassure those MPs who want to uphold the role of devolved assemblies that repealing OPA would not write a particular abortion law for anyone, but it would require them to act. This proposal would respect devolution. It would not reject it. I'll happily give way to my colleague.
I just want to be absolutely clear. What I think the Honourable Lady is suggesting there is that Northern Ireland has UK abortion at 24 weeks and not Republic of Ireland abortion at 12 weeks. Is that correct?
Let me reassure the gentleman, I'm not proposing any particular law. What we are talking about doing is repealing the existing UK legislation that then requires Northern Irish law to act in a certain way. In doing so, unlike imposing a referendum or extending the 1967 Act, it would be in line with both our human rights responsibilities, which is why the United Nations has asked us to do this, and it would not impose a specific outcome on Northern Ireland. Indeed, I believe that holding a referendum, if I can, I'll make a little bit of progress, and absolutely I'll give way to my friend from Dwiff or Mirinid first.
Would she not explain possibly and possibly agree with me that this actually, by repealing the Offences Against the Person Act, actually gives more powers to devolution in that event?
Absolutely. My colleague in writing this proposal is absolutely right. What it does is it simply means that the Northern Irish Assembly, if it's reconstituted, cannot ignore this issue because there would be a gap that would then need to be filled by medical regulation. If I can, I'd like to make a little bit of progress because I realise some of this is quite technical. I also want to set out very clearly why a referendum is not the right approach. Because those who are suggesting it need to be clear about what the question would be, what they would consult the public on, indeed who would write the question, or indeed whether, if that law were passed, who would then implement it. And indeed, if we were to have a referendum on bringing abortion rights to Northern Ireland or a particular form of abortion, would then we also allow a referendum, say, on other contested issues, such as the union itself? That's why I may not share the views of my colleagues from the DUP about a woman's right to choose, but I find myself in agreement with the member for Langan Valley, who I know has written to one of his constituents, saying that inevitably it is Westminster politicians who will have to make a call on this particular proposal, and that he recognises that this is a law that applies to the whole of the United Kingdom and not just Northern Ireland, and so it is right for MPs in this House to consider whether repealing sections 58 and 59 of OPA is the right thing to do. I also note that he recognises and acknowledges there is no substantive support amongst local political parties in Northern Ireland for extending the 67 Act, because people would like to be able to write their own legislation. By repealing OPA, we make that a possibility, and therefore we make that a possibility in England and in Wales as well. I'll happily give way.
I thank her for giving way. Just to be absolutely clear, will she agree repealing the 1861 Act allows us to adhere and respect devolution settlements and women's right to choose? They are not contradictory.
Absolutely, and indeed it is in line with respecting the work that has gone on in the Northern Irish Assembly when it was constituted on abortion rights, the working parties that have started to look at the kinds of medical regulation that may be required. Because there isn't an assembly at the moment, those rules cannot be taken forward. But even if there was an assembly, OPA, unless it is repealed, would define that conversation. I'll happily give way.
Thank the member for giving way. The member will of course know that in 2016, when the Assembly debated this matter, they rejected totally the proposals that she is actually making to the House. Does she agree with me that by removing sections 58 and 59, there would be no regulatory framework in Northern Ireland whatsoever to govern legal abortions? There would be a massive hole left in the law in Northern Ireland, and there would be no right by the medical practitioners to actually exercise their conscientious objection to this.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, because I think it's helpful for people to understand how the DUP interpret the situation. I obviously interpret the situation differently, because I look at what happened in the Assembly when actually the DUP argued that the idea required proper consideration. So they didn't reject the idea. This is around fatal-fetal abnormality, and indeed set up a working party which has just reported a report about how the conditions to access to medical abortion may or may not occur. So the idea that this was rejected out of hand by the Assembly, I don't think is fair. I also would gently highlight to the gentleman from Northern Ireland that there have been 2 Assembly elections since then, so there's no guarantee that the view of the Assembly would be the same as the view in 2016. And indeed, the argument he is making is precisely for the Northern Irish Assembly, or indeed the civil servants, to be able to fill the gap, rather than against the gap being created by repealing this UK legislation. Let me also be clear to other members here who may have heard the suggestion that there wouldn't be any safeguards. If I can, I'm just going to continue a little bit. Well, then I'll happily give way, because I'd love to hear what the member has to say.
Thank you. Until directly before coming to this House, I actually worked for 2 years in gynaecology clinics, and one of those clinics was termination of pregnancy clinics. And actually, if a doctor's got a conscientious objection, they don't have to sign Certificate A's. They can come out of that process and not do that.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her contribution to this debate. It is much welcomed. Let me also reassure members that, like every other medical procedure, there are safeguards in place that are not held within OPA itself, or even within the Abortion Act, but existing medical regulation. Therefore, these would not change with decriminalisation. Indeed, the 1967 Act, which is supposed to safeguard women, says nothing about informed consent. It's entirely silent on these issues. Clinicians are required by law to obtain informed consent before performing any medical procedure or risk criminal sanction. What we are asking for, then, is for abortion to be subject to exactly the same medical regulations as all other procedures. By repealing OPA as a UK Parliament, we can show women across the UK we trust them with their own health care, wherever they live. We also can show that we trust every legislator, including Northern Ireland, to create modern abortion laws. So the crucial issue before those of us who support decriminalisation is, when can we do this? And this is the question for me, for the ministers today. Because the government is currently consulting... Actually, I'll happily give way one more time, and I really do want to make progress.
So the honourable member has mentioned that this is very technical and there's a lot of legislation to go through. But can I ask her one small question? In her aims and objectives and all of this, where does the rights of the unborn child and life to that child come into this? Where does it come into it?
So, if I may, I will happily come on to the question about rights and about the moral debates around abortion, because I recognise there are different decisions within this House and indeed within Northern Ireland on this issue, and therefore that's why this is not a partisan issue. So if I may, I'd like to finish my point, and then I will come on to exactly the point that he's making, because the government is currently consulting on domestic abuse legislation, and indeed I have previously met with the former Home Secretary to discuss this and the opportunity this bill presents to make progress. Now, I understand from ministers their concern to stop abortion being used to control women, and so their interest in OPA within that legislation was perhaps different to mine. I would also highlight to them that the Serious Crimes Act 2015 criminalises controlling or coercive behaviour in family or intimate relationships. Indeed, I would argue that the men who've been prosecuted under OPA for intentionally causing the loss of a wanted pregnancy could well have been prosecuted under existing assault law. Furthermore, organisations like Women's Aid and End Violence Against Women both support decriminalisation because they recognise the current criminalisation puts vulnerable women at risk. A study showed 1 in 5 women who bought pills online did so because they were in a violent or controlling relationship. We don't protect women by criminalising them. That's why so many medical bodies are also calling for decriminalisation. The Royal Colleges and the British Medical Association, just some of them. Indeed, the President of the Obstetrics and Gynaecologists has argued that the legal situation in Northern Ireland means that their healthcare professionals struggle to provide the support they would like to for women who need an abortion or to safely manage any post-abortion complications. We know too that this is the view of the Northern Irish public, that the majority, whether they come from any particular political background, religious background, age or ethnicity, would like to see abortion being managed as a medical rather than a criminal issue. So I have respect for those people who hold a difference of view on abortion itself and the role that it plays in equality. But I see abortion as an equalities issue. Because men and women will never truly be free whilst one cannot control what happens to their own body. Indeed, as the residents of Gilead has shown us, it is fundamental to human rights. So I make no apology putting the safety and dignity of women first as part of equality between the sexes. I know the abuse that I will get online for saying so, because frankly, women get the blame whatever we do in our situations. Indeed, judging by the emails I've had today, it's either mine or my mother's fault. I made the mistake that many MPs make of actually reading my emails today. Your views are a disgrace to humanity and a betrayal of the truly innocent. Women can always say no or keep their clothes on. You, madam, were once an embryo. You, madam, were once a fetus in your mother's womb. You were once a pre-born baby. I wonder what decision you have wanted your mother to make about your life or death had she been given the opportunity in the months before you were born. Now, I respect those who disagree with abortion on all grounds as a matter of faith. And I say to those who only think of the extremes this simplest point. If you only support access to abortion in cases of rape or incest or fatal fetal abnormality, then in essence your concern is more about the manner that a woman became pregnant in than abortion. Why does it matter to trust women and give them the chance to control their own bodies, not to be forced to continue an unwanted pregnancy? Because it is about freedom. So shout at me all you want. This is not Gilead, and we should not be frightened to speak up for the equal rights of women. Because to do so is to put women's life and liberation at risk. Because the truth is, in 2018, we still don't trust our own women. This is the one healthcare decision that no UK woman can make on her own. That's why the UN has called on us to repeal these specific sections of law. And no assembly, or indeed this place, can make any progressive law for itself on this subject without doing so. So in supporting this proposal, every member can send a message that in 2018, all the women of the UK deserve to be treated as equal citizens. I'm just about to finish. 100 years ago, 150 years rather, is a long time to wait for social justice. So let's not wait anymore. Today, we ask the ministers to commit to a timetable when the will of the House can be tested on this issue, where rather than waiting 150 years, we wait at most 150 days before we see change, so that we truly get, in the 21st century laws. That the D of the debate is today, but that we have a time for the other D, decision-making, in order to bring dignity to all of our constituents. I ask the ministers, give us a date.
Order. The question is that this House has considered the role of the UK Parliament in repealing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. I'm afraid it will be necessary, on account of the heavily subscribed character of the debate, to begin with a limit on backbench speeches of 6 minutes. Mrs. Maria Miller.
Yes, Speaker. And can I apologise to the House for the fact I've got to leave this debate early today, but I could not resist the Honourable Lady from Walthamstow's impassioned call for a debate yesterday, and to be here today to take part in it. It deserves a debate, and we should never be afraid to say what we think in this place, particularly on issues of conscience. And we need a change. In 2016, 724 women from Northern Ireland travelled from Northern Ireland to England for abortion care. I think it's wrong that women in Northern Ireland don't have the same access to abortion as my constituents do, and I would like to thank BPAS and Basingstoke, and particularly their manager there at Annette Service, for writing to me with her impassioned plea for change in this area. I believe that this situation should not exist. The fact that the same rights are not available to 1 in 4 parts of the UK is difficult to understand. Not even for fatal fetal abnormalities, rape or incest. Why, oh why, in 2003, was it decided to devolve this sensitive matter that relates to international obligations, such as the one the Honourable Lady talked about, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of discrimination against women, and indeed the Istanbul Convention. It is difficult to understand from even the Hansel transcript the rationale for why this was done in this way. And in many ways, it feels as if
the rights of Northern Irish women were traded as part of the devolution settlement. People in Northern Ireland want change. The Northern Ireland Assembly has acknowledged that, and the Department of Justice report that was issued in 2015 said very clearly that there was a pressing need to change the criminal law to provide terminations in clearly defined circumstances. The general public wants change, and indeed the latest Amnesty International poll suggests that 68% of Northern Irish people feel that people should not be punished if they have an abortion. Professional bodies want change. The Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Indeed.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Does she think, therefore, perhaps the time has come for a referendum on this subject in Northern Ireland, just as there has been in the Irish Republic?
My honourable friend's brought up an important issue, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And I think there may be a role for a way for people in Northern Ireland to express their views at a time when they don't have a functioning Northern Ireland Assembly. Mr. Speaker, I was talking about the people calling for change, whether it's the Northern Ireland Assembly, Department of Justice, the general public, professional bodies, but also, as the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow talked about, the courts also considering the need for change as well. And there is a case before the Supreme Court which will be pronounced upon very shortly. I really commend the... I'll take the Honourable Lady, then I must make some progress.
Well, Lady for giving way, and she's making a powerful case for change in this area. I wonder if she could tell the House what she now believes would be the best course for her government to take to facilitate a decision in this area.
Thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I'm just going to come on to that in the very short time I've got remaining. I commend the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow for bringing this before us today. But I think the House has to understand, and I think she made it clearer perhaps today than she did in her intervention yesterday, that repealing 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act would have some profound impacts for the whole of the United Kingdom. I'm not saying that those changes aren't ones that could be argued for strongly, but I believe that the debate today was about the situation facing women in Northern Ireland, and I think we need to make sure that we are focusing on that particularly in this conversation today, because decriminalisation is an option, she's right, but it's not the only option for improving the situation for women in Northern Ireland. And I'd just like to draw on three particular issues that we consider in this debate today. Firstly, is there a disconnect between public opinion and the policies that are being pursued in Northern Ireland? What progress has actually been made on the ground, and what action, if any, can this government take to make sure that if progress is lacking, then things can be done to rectify that? It feels to me when I read the research, and I read the consultation, which was extensive and very thorough, that there can be a strong argument made for a call for change being inherent in the community in Northern Ireland. I don't represent that community, and I look at the honourable gentleman and lady over on the other side of the benches, and I hope in their contribution to today they're able to explain why there is an apparent difference between the public opinion that is being offered to us and the approach that's been taken to date by the devolved administration. And I deliberately tread carefully on this and respectfully, because I truly believe that we should not enter into any changes here which would make people feel disenfranchised as part of this process. I think we have to secondly recognise that a great deal of progress has already been made, and I think that probably hasn't gone into in a great deal of detail so far in this debate. The consultation in 2014, the report in 2015 calling, as I say, for a pressing need for change in the criminal law to provide lawful terminations in clearly defined circumstances, that has already been called for. In 2016, legislation introduced by the then Minister for Justice to bring about some of those changes. And then in 2018, just last month, a report from a working group on fatal fetal abnormalities, again recommending change, comes in. So change is called for. What can we do now, today, to try and make sure that the absence of an executive and an assembly doesn't stand in the way of that? There are clearly opportunities around the court case that's going through the Supreme Court, and I hope the Minister's able to share with us more the government's feelings on that. Also, what action, perhaps the Minister can also talk about what action is able to be taken in the absence of an executive to continue the deliberations and the important detailed work that's needed in this place, if the lady could forgive me. And also, can the Minister consider and share with the House, if no action is taken, which I simply don't believe will be the case, but if that is the case, that no action is taken when there is a Northern Ireland Assembly formed, what can this government do to ensure that there are no potential breaches of international conventions such as the ones that I've already talked about? Mr Speaker, this place legislated to devolve powers on abortion to Northern Ireland. We can't ride roughshod over that, and we have a responsibility to uphold the law. Equally, the lack of a functioning Assembly hampers progress. Westminster has a right to disagree with the Assembly and the actions that it's taken, and this debate today should be a vigorous exploration of all those arguments. But we have clear international responsibilities for outlawing discrimination against women, and we need to make sure that we, as Westminster parliamentarians, are doing that for women in the four corners of this United Kingdom.
Well done. Thank you. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate as a Member of Parliament, having represented my constituency for 21 years. I sometimes listen to debates in this place, and I think that when people look at me, they think that I have a disconnect with the people that I represent. Frankly, Mr Speaker, I would not have been returned to this House for my 6th term in Parliament if I was so disconnected from the people I represent. I am their voice in this House, and I respect the voices of others, but I think the voices of the elected representatives from Northern Ireland should be heard on this debate. It is an issue of great sensitivity, which deeply divides opinion both in this House and indeed beyond it, and in Northern Ireland. The subject of abortion incites strong and passionate responses for understandable reasons. I take part in this debate with that reality firmly in mind. My party has been from its very inception a pro-life party. We believe law and policy in Northern Ireland should affirm and uphold the rights of both mothers and unborn children. We have not been alone in Northern Ireland in upholding this stance. Politicians across the political divide and the religious spectrum in Northern Ireland and indeed in other parts of the United Kingdom have and continue to hold a similar view to this party. This includes both Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland, and indeed people of all faiths and none. Nationalist parliamentarians like the former member for Foyle, Mark Durkan, who spoke eloquently in this House in defence of the pro-life position. Some of the best proponents of a pro-life position in Northern Ireland have come from the Republican tradition. People like Francie Brawley, a former Sinn Féin MLA. People like his wife, Anne, who was the former mayor of Limavady. Both Sinn Féin representatives who hold a pro-life position. So the idea that the only party in Northern Ireland that is pro-life, that holds this view, is the DUP, is a nonsense, and that it betrays an ignorance of the political situation in Northern Ireland and of the views of political parties that I would encourage members to acquaint themselves more closely with. It is, of course.
Is the honourable gentleman aware that in countries where abortion is legally restricted, there are 37 abortions per 1,000 women? Where abortion is readily available, there are 34 abortions per 1,000 women. Restrictive abortion laws do not prevent women from seeking abortion. They only endanger women's health and lives as women seek unsafe procedures. That is not pro-life.
Well said.
Well, I beg to differ with the honourable lady, and research in Northern Ireland shows that since 1967 and the introduction of the Abortion Act here, 100,000 people in Northern Ireland are alive today because we did not accept that law in Northern Ireland. That is research that has been backed up with proper scientific fact. And therefore I am proud of that pro-life position. I am proud of the fact that there are so many people alive in Northern Ireland today because we have a law that respects the rights of both women and of the unborn child, and we will maintain that position. Mr. Speaker, contrary to some of the claims made by some in favour of liberalising the law in Northern Ireland, the law in Northern Ireland has been shown to reduce the number of abortions in our jurisdiction. That is a fact. And the Both Lives Matter campaign, which has been very effective in Northern Ireland, has demonstrated with its research that this is the case. For that reason, I am very thoughtful about any change in the law in Northern Ireland. Furthermore, we have long argued that it is for the people of Northern Ireland, through the Northern Ireland Assembly, to decide on what the law on abortion should be, and I very much respect the points made by the Honourable Lady, the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Basingstoke, in that regard, and we thank her for that acknowledgement. This House in 2008 made a decision to devolve to Northern Ireland the policing and justice powers, as the Right Honourable Lady reminded us. This House took that decision, and it included the power to decide what the law on abortion in Northern Ireland should be. And the Labour Party was the government in power at that time. They took that decision. And I would just remind my Right Honourable and Honourable colleagues from the Labour Party that they actually don't contest elections in Northern Ireland. Therefore, if they want to test the water in this, we invite them to come and to contest elections in Northern Ireland and to put their views forward. We are a functioning democracy, and I might point out that their sister party in Northern Ireland is a pro-life party. I must move on, Mr. Speaker, on this issue. For our part, the DUP stands ready to take its place in both the Assembly and the Executive, today and without preconditions. We are ready to take on responsibility for governing Northern Ireland, and we stand ready to work with other parties to take decisions on sensitive issues like abortion, to arrive at an outcome that reflects the will of the people of Northern Ireland, that respects the rights of both women and unborn children, and upholds the principle that both lives matter.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I welcome, and does he agree with me, that although there are deeply sensitive issues we must consider in Northern Ireland, such as life-limiting conditions also referred to as fatal fetal abnormality, what this proposal would do would be to impose on the people of Northern Ireland one of the most liberal abortion regimes anywhere in the world, of abortion on demand up to 24 weeks, in the absence, and it's a fact, in the absence of a regime or guidelines, because currently those do not exist, and if this went ahead, there would be nothing there apart from the legality and decriminalisation up to 24 weeks.
I thank the Honourable Member for South Belfast for that intervention, and in truth, Mr. Speaker, if what is proposed under this motion was to actually happen, it would have dramatic consequences for Northern Ireland, and that is absolutely clear, and I think even the mover of the motion acknowledged that there would be a very significant gap. So we need to have this debate in Northern Ireland, a reasoned debate that engages the political parties and civil society, so that we can collect the voices and come to a decision on how best to proceed in regard to the law on abortion. Indeed, within the Northern Ireland Executive, the DUP supported the establishment of the expert working group, which has now published its report, specifically on the question of unborn children who have been diagnosed with a life-limiting condition. We are considering that report, which has recently been published, and the key recommendations it makes. This is a very sensitive area, and women in receipt of such devastating diagnosis deserve our utmost sympathy and our support. No one could fail to be moved by the harrowing cases of those who have found themselves in such tragic circumstances. And we want to develop a new Northern Ireland-wide service for women in these circumstances to ensure that they receive the best information and advice coordinated care and to ease their journey through our healthcare system. I'm also keen to ensure that we enhance our perinatal palliative care with a view to Northern Ireland becoming an exemplar in this region, in this area. But we want to listen to the voices, Mr. Speaker, of civil society. We want to listen to what people have to say. Voices of women like Sarah Ure, who has spoken passionately about her own experience of pregnancy and abortion in the most difficult of circumstances, and has argued for the case for change in cases involving unborn children with life-limiting conditions. But I also refer to the voice of my own constituent, who wrote to me last evening when hearing about this debate and said, apparently there is to be a discussion in the Commons on our abortion laws. As the daughter of a rape victim and a non-represented Catholic, I would ask that you take a positive pro-life stance and protect the most vulnerable in our society. Mr. Speaker, there are strong voices on both sides of this debate. This is a devolved issue. It should be left to the people of Northern Ireland to decide.
Well, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I remind colleagues that inexorably the time limit on backbench speeches will fall if there are huge numbers of interventions, though interventions inevitably there are, that's part of the debate, and if frontbenchers not so constrained were inadvertently to dilate at excessive length. And I know that they won't, because that would be uncollegiate, and they won't want to be uncollegiate. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Secretary Karen Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by welcoming the opportunity to take part in this debate on this incredibly important issue. I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady and all honourable members who have secured this debate, and I pay particular tribute to the Honourable Lady. She has campaigned on this issue for many years. I know she will continue to campaign on it, and I always welcome the opportunity to hear her incredibly passionate and moving contribution. I also want to apologise, Mr. Speaker. As you know, I will need to leave the chamber before the end of the debate. My honourable friend, the member for North West Cambridgeshire, will be here throughout the whole debate, as are ministers from government departments that cover a whole spectrum of the issues that we are debating today. And I will ensure that if there are specific points that need responding to, that I do respond personally to members who make them during the debate. I and you, Mr. Speaker, have listened very carefully to all of the different views that have been expressed today and previously on this matter, and it is clear that there are a range of views across this House. I am also aware of the personal stories that lie behind this issue. Abortion is a very sensitive issue, regardless of where your views lie. It is therefore important that we debate this issue with due care and sensitivity, and that is why I stood yesterday to support the Honourable Lady in securing this debate. It has long been the case that the issue of abortion has been a matter of conscience in this House, a matter which has been and which will continue to be subject to a free vote. And while I appreciate that the recent referendum in Ireland has undoubtedly reinvigorated debate within Northern Ireland and across the rest of the United Kingdom, we have to be careful not to react without careful consideration. I will.
Giving way. Is she going to that point where she's travelling today in her speech, where she's acknowledging that what we're actually debating today is not about Northern Ireland? That what we have in front of us is a proposal that would fundamentally change forever the rules governing abortion across the whole of the United Kingdom. And that should not be done in the heat of the moment following something that happened in a foreign jurisdiction in the Republic of Ireland.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes an important point, and I think that it is important to note that the proposals that we're debating today would have an implication across the whole United Kingdom, but I will restrict my remarks to Northern Ireland, if he will forgive me. Of course.
I'm very grateful, and I'm grateful for the tone that she's adopting in this debate. Can I just say to her, though, that in the previous Parliament in March 2017, this issue of the repeal of Section 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861 was debated. I brought a 10-minute rule bill, and actually there was a vote in this Parliament, and it was successful. It had the support of the House. So I think this issue has been around for some time. I don't think it's something that we're rushing to in haste.
Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady. I know she had her 10-minute rule bill, and she feels passionate about this issue too. The point I'm merely making is that, as Northern Ireland Secretary, I am looking at this in the context of Northern Ireland. There is a wider debate, and that is why there are ministers from government departments that are affected by the issue of abortion, because it is an extremely sensitive issue. There are many strongly held views across all sides of the debate, and particularly across all sides of the debate for abortion reform in Northern Ireland. Let me turn to the referendum in Ireland, which was undoubtedly a significant moment in the history of that country. And its read across to the situation in the United Kingdom has to be treated with care. On the 25th of May this year, Ireland voted to repeal the relevant article of its constitution, commonly known as the Eighth Amendment, which since 1983 has given unborn fetuses and pregnant women an equal right to life. This referendum followed many years of debate and discussion in Ireland, and the process is not yet over, as now, although a significant majority supported repeal, that process now needs to be debated and pass through both houses of the Irish Parliament to determine what type of reform works best for Ireland. And it's important to be clear that what we witnessed, if I can just finish this sentence, that what we witnessed in Ireland was specific to Ireland, where a change to their written constitution requires a referendum. I will, of course, give way.
Is the example in Ireland a perfect example of what this proposal is? To remove the bar, the criminal offence, and then to allow a debate in this place and in other places, in other devolved areas, of how they would like abortion to then be regulated. And is that not where we should be going and not restricting?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, that is undoubtedly what the debate is about today, whether that is the right approach. But I just want to be clear that in the Republic of Ireland, a referendum is required for constitutional change. That is not the situation in the United Kingdom, including in Northern Ireland. And I do want to be clear that there are very significant differences. We do not know what the Irish law will look like. That has to be debated. It has to be taken through both houses of the Irish Parliament. We cannot simply read across from that vote. And it was a referendum, if I could just finish this point, it was a referendum which was decided by the people of Ireland, and it's now to be taken forward by the Irish Government. It is clearly a matter for the Irish, and it should not be implied that that should automatically extend to the people of Northern Ireland. Of course, I give way to the Honourable Lady, who I know has a great interest in this area.
So I'm interested in her thoughts. She is, of course, right that the situation is very different in the Republic. But the situation is now very important across the island of Ireland, which has massive implications across Northern Ireland for what has happened. Has she spoken with the Irish Government about the implications of women travelling from the north to the south and the relationship now, in the spirit of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, on this issue on the island of Ireland?
Mr. Speaker, I have of course spoken to the Irish Government, as I do regularly and as I do with all parties, the main parties in Northern Ireland also. But let's be clear, this was a referendum to allow a change in the law. The law has not changed in the Republic. In Ireland, there is still a prohibition on abortion, as there was previously, and it is now for the Irish Parliament, both houses, to debate what that law should look like. And therefore, I want to make the point that this is not a simple process, and that this takes time and needs consideration, as it will in Ireland, in the Irish Parliament. I will.
Would the Secretary of State agree that the legal effect of the repeal of sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861 would be to allow terminations right up to the point of birth?
No. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think there are a number of interpretations of what it may or may not mean, but that is part of a separate debate, I would suggest. That today we are debating the matter in Northern Ireland, and I would therefore wish to return to the matter of Northern Ireland and make some progress, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I think it's worth pointing out what we're talking about today is repeal of OPA across the United Kingdom. Yes. We're not talking about getting rid of the Preservation of Infant Life Act 1929, which criminalises abortion after 24 weeks. Nobody's talking about changing the time limit, either in England and Wales or imposing it in Northern Ireland. Clearly, in this debate, it's facts, not fiction, that matters.
Mr Speaker, I will make some progress now, but I did want to hear from the Honourable Lady as the sponsor of the debate. Turning to the situation in Northern Ireland, I'm aware that there are a number of voices calling for reform, including the women and girls most affected. But what is clear to me is that there is currently no consensus on what that reform should be, even amongst those who want to see change in Northern Ireland. For example, there are those in favour of extending abortion in cases of fatal fetal abnormality or in cases of rape and incest, but others want to extend the laws that apply here to Northern Ireland. There are a number of views and we have to consider them all respectfully. And of course, all sides in this debate should be listened to with courtesy and respect. Abortion has always been a devolved matter in Northern Ireland since Northern Ireland was created in 1921, and it would not be appropriate for Westminster to seek to impose its will or be the arbiter of this issue that has long been devolved to the people of Northern Ireland. The Government believes that the question of any future reform in Northern Ireland must also be debated and decided by the people of Northern Ireland and their locally elected and therefore accountable politicians. This is, of course, will.
Mr Speaker, I'm very grateful indeed to the Secretary of State, and I've listened very, very carefully and intently to what she's had to say. She did use the phrase that change takes time, and it does. However, I would ask the Secretary of State to think very carefully about the number of women who are compelled to leave Northern Ireland, to go to Scotland, to go to England, and may, in future times, be able to go to the Republic of Ireland for an abortion. For those women who access online pills which are desperately dangerous, what is the Secretary of State saying to them? How long are we going to have to wait for change?
Well, Mr Speaker, this House determined that we should provide support for women to travel to Great Britain to receive support, to receive abortions. Personally, I want to see reform in Northern Ireland, but it is a matter for the people of Northern Ireland. And as this is an issue that has always... I am going to make some progress, but I will hear the voice of Scotland.
This is not a Scottish-specific point. This is a point about the... This is a point about the Supreme Court, which is due to rule on Thursday. My understanding is that if the Supreme Court on Thursday rules that the situation in Northern Ireland is incompatible with the ECHR, then it will be the responsibility of the UK Government to act under Section 26 of the Northern Ireland Act, because it's the UK Government that has the responsibility to fulfil international treaty obligations. Am I correct in that understanding?
Mr Speaker, I apologise. I realise she's not the only voice of Scotland, and that there were many other voices of Scotland we will hear today. But I'm not going to prejudge the Supreme Court Act, the Supreme Court judgment. We will receive the judgment, we believe, on Thursday, and when we have that judgment, we will carefully consider it. But if I can go back to the matter of Northern Ireland, this is a matter of conscience. A free vote on this issue in this House would be afforded if the matter of abortion comes before the House again, and the same applies in Northern Ireland. That is why, Mr Speaker, the Government, like its predecessors, believes that the best forum to debate and resolve these and many other matters is in a locally elected Northern Ireland Assembly. So the Government's priority remains to urgently re-establish strong, inclusive, devolved government at the earliest opportunity. And as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I want to ensure that any future reform is handled with due care and consideration, with locally elected and locally accountable politicians having the opportunity to consider and debate the issues, and for the people of Northern Ireland to be able to contribute to the debate on the devolved issues that affect their lives. And just as only because it's the Honourable Lady, and then I will make progress.
Greenway, I agree with everything she's just said. Can she explain why she thinks repealing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861 would not allow that to happen? Because we think it would.
Mr Speaker, as I have said, that is a matter that would affect the whole of the United Kingdom, and that is a debate that therefore should be had in the whole of the United Kingdom context, looking at all of those matters. And just as we have debated in this House the laws that ought to apply here, the democratically elected Assembly in Northern Ireland must continue to consider this fundamental issue, listening to the views of the people of Northern Ireland. Or, as my right honourable friend from Basingstoke suggested, we are in danger of disenfranchising 1.8 million citizens of the United Kingdom. And so my focus is therefore, I'm sorry, I will make progress because there are many other people who want to speak, and I do want to make sure that everyone has their chance. My focus is therefore on working closely with Northern Ireland's political parties to restore the devolved government that the public wants, and that remains my top priority. And I also want to continue to hear from those in civil society on all sides of the debate, as I am deeply sympathetic to the cases being debated. Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has been clear in her support for women's rights in respect of access to safe abortions, and she welcomed the referendum result in Ireland. We are in agreement that the best way forward for Northern Ireland is through locally accountable politicians making important decisions through devolution, and for the people of Northern Ireland to have their say on the devolved issues which affect their daily lives. Thank you.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I also begin by congratulating my honourable friend for Walthamstow and those who, honourable members on all sides of the House, who sought this debate today. I'd also like to mention my honourable friend for Hull North, who's campaigned on this issue now for many years. And I, like the Secretary of State, will concentrate significantly on the situation in Northern Ireland. There is no doubt that the referendum in the Republic 10 days ago, 12 days ago, whenever, has altered not the constitutionality of the situation anywhere in the United Kingdom, and not at all in Northern Ireland, but it has most certainly changed the way the conversation is now taking place. And we have to take that into account. But, Mr Speaker, one of the things that I think I want to establish in this debate is that, yes, whilst we will discuss the legalese of Sections 58 and 9 of the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, whilst we'll talk about the esoteric levels of human rights, not to trivialise that, actually, in the end, this is about people. It is about women like Sarah, the honourable member for Lagan Valley referred to, a woman who had the most immense difficulty on discovering that the baby that she was carrying would be born with no skull, could not survive that birth process, could not go on to live, who had to travel in the most difficult circumstances, having been given actually chronically bad support from the medical profession in Northern Ireland, had to travel to England for that safe and lawful abortion. That kind of case, Mr Speaker, ought to condition the way we see this issue. It's about people, it's about women in distress. Now, I, like many members of this House, have seen the joy of happy pregnancy. In my own family, one of my daughters gave birth earlier on this year. What a great moment that is. But I've also seen the downside, the tragedy of people who know that the fetus that they conceived in hope is born to die. That the situation of women who had become pregnant as a result of rape. These things we have to take on board and recognise the humanity. And yes, I don't doubt anybody's legitimacy in putting forward the arguments that they want to pursue, but I'm absolutely determined that I state that there is a human being behind every one of these situations, and we've got to remember that as we debate these matters. Now, obviously, the other issue that I would want to just bring before the House, something that the honourable member for Edinburgh South West mentioned a little bit earlier on. The decision before the Supreme Court actually is going to make a profound difference. But the position of my own party has been very, very clear. The last election, our manifesto was very clear on the situation in Northern Ireland. We said we would seek to provide, in conjunction with the Northern Ireland Assembly, the legislative framework that allowed for safe, legal abortion for those women in Northern Ireland who made that choice. And that is where we want to see things happen. We want to see that legislation take place in the Stormont Assembly. But I've got to say, my honourable friend from Walthamstow said nothing that ran in contradiction to that process. This is legislation that, in actual fact, would, of course, demand change, but it gives the opportunity for the Stormont Assembly to make the legislative framework for the people, and in particular the women of Northern Ireland. That's important, but there is a challenge behind that, because I think I heard the Honourable Member for Lagan Valley say that they would go back to the Assembly without precondition. Now, I hope that's the case, because there is a real challenge now to all the Assembly politicians. You've got to get back to the Stormont Assembly. If you, yes, I'll give way just the Honourable Member to say, if you want to be taken seriously on this debate and on other issues, we cannot see, Mr. Speaker, forgive me, we cannot see a situation where civil servants make decisions. We cannot see a situation when those without an electoral mandate make decisions. But in that case, it's incumbent on the Northern Ireland Assembly members to get back to the Assembly. Of course,
very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's someone I hold in high esteem and have greatest respect for, and so on. The reality is he knows. He doesn't have to hope. He knows. The Democratic Unionist Party would go into government tomorrow on the basis of what we agreed previously, as would, I understand, the Ulster Unionists, the SDLP and the Alliance Party. Sinn Féin do not want to go in. They want to have preconditions. So there is no doubt about our commitment to going into government, having the Assembly up and running, debating all these issues. And we have no petition of concern veto in the Northern Ireland Assembly anymore. So these are matters. Those who shout hardest about wanting this issue resolved should get the Assembly up and running. We agree with that. Get on with it.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't quite sure whether the no precondition of his honourable friend has just been undermined by the honourable member. But nevertheless, let's say this. I think in that sense it would be very helpful if the Secretary of State would now be saying to all the parties in the Assembly, get round the table with the Secretary of State, let's see this issue of law reform around abortion, one that's on the table as part of it. If this matters, then it must transcend some of the other issues that have caused blockage in the recent past. And that is a challenge, I know, to members from Northern Ireland, both in this Westminster Parliament as well as in the Northern Ireland Assembly. But it's a challenge that politicians have to take up. We've got to see the Assembly up and running, and that's absolutely fundamental. But I would say as well, Mr. Speaker, there is, I mentioned before the case that lies before the Supreme Court, and the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South West was absolutely right in the question she posed to the Secretary of State, because, of course, that case that lies before the Supreme Court, I can't anticipate how they will respond to the case, but what the case turns on is the situation as to whether it is compatible with our Charter obligations under the Convention obligations under the Convention of Human Rights, for there to be no access for women who are bearing children as a result of rape, incest, or with fatal fetal abnormality or extreme malformation of the fetus, to obtain that legal, safe abortion in Northern Ireland. If the Supreme Court does resolve that, the incompatibility of our law won't be about Northern Ireland, it will be about the United Kingdom. Now, I must say to the Secretary of State, if the Supreme Court does make the decision in that one direction, I think she and her colleagues in Cabinet will now have to take very serious consideration as to why and how we could not begin to address that at the Westminster level. It would be a Westminster issue, not a Stormont issue. And I think that needs to be, of course, a good way.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way on that point. But does it not actually identify a huge flaw in this entire debate? 98% of all abortions carried out in the United Kingdom are carried out on pregnancies that could continue to full term. They're not inconvenient, they're not fatal abnormality cases, they're not cases as a result of crisis pregnancies, they're unwanted pregnancies. And the matter that he is now saying should be introduced to Northern Ireland is not about the minority and difficult cases, but it's about opening up termination of life to all.
Absolutely.
And that is the fatal flaw in his argument, because it's something that is rejected out of hand by all of the parties in Northern Ireland.
I'm sorry, I do have to say to the Honourable Member that he wasn't listening to anything I've said. What I've said was, I think, has been very clear, that in the case of the Westminster Parliament having to respond to the Supreme Court, that is in a very limited and restricted number of cases, very, very clearly defined. I also said that it would be incumbent upon the Stormont that it would be incumbent on the Stormont Assembly to legislate for the situation in Northern Ireland. And in that case, it would be up to the Assembly to decide the limitations on the law and the impact of the law in Northern Ireland. Of course, give way.
To the gentleman for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech, and I agree with much of what he says. But would he agree with me? It's also very important, especially in relation to the comment that's just been made from my right honourable friend over there, not to forget that this is actually about the right of a woman to choose. It is not just confined to those who have fetal abnormalities or may have been raped or in some ghastly incestuous relationship. This is about women's rights and our right to control what we do with our bodies.
Well, and I obviously I do agree, and let me make it very clear that my voting record is clear on this issue. I will briefly.
I felt you were maybe the gentleman was going to say something about convenient, abortions being convenient. I worked in those clinics and I counselled those women. And can I tell you, they are not done for convenience. Some of those people are utterly desperate by the time they get to those clinics. And it would be really wrong to think that people treat it as a matter of convenience.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend because, of course, she's right. She's absolutely right on this. This isn't a matter of convenience. The heart-rending decision that I know that many women that I've spoken to over the years, many of the women I've represented, but many people I've known in different ways who have to go through the agonising decision as to whether abortion is the right choice for them, nevertheless should lie with them and certainly should not lie with laws that restrict that capacity. But nevertheless, the point I would still want to emphasise, Mr Speaker, is that what we're saying is that, and what my honourable friend for Walthamstow is saying, is that we want to see, it is the position of the Labour Party, we are the Good Friday Party, we believe. It is our position. We want to see devolved government work, but politicians in Northern Ireland have got to make it work on this issue. They cannot shy away from it. If this issue matters to the people they represent, then they have to be in the Assembly making the laws for the people of Northern Ireland. Mr Speaker, there are many people who want to speak, and I don't intend to prolong it too much longer, except simply I want to conclude as I began. You know, this isn't, in the end, an issue about lawyers. It's not an issue about even the philosophy of abortion. It is really about real people. It's about real women, very often in situations of distress, very often who are looking for the law to allow them to pursue something that at the moment, in the case of Northern Ireland, is prevented. That ought to be unconscionable. It ought to be unconscionable that a woman who is bearing a child doomed to die is made to continue to carry on that child. It ought to be unconscionable that a woman who provides, as we one case that does exist, who provided a 15-year-old daughter with the capacity to terminate a pregnancy, is now still facing criminal prosecution. In that basis, humanity cries out now for a change in the law. So I want once again to congratulate my honourable friend for Walthamstow. This is a really important debate. It isn't a concluding debate. This will simply, cannot be passed today. Even if we pass legislation to make the words of the motion before us into law, it would still need other legal change, both UK-wide and most definitely in Northern Ireland. It is devolution compatible. Politicians in Northern Ireland now must make that devolution work.
Thank you. Order. I fear the 6-minute limit on backbench speeches won't last much longer, to judge by how things are going. Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr Speaker, could I start by paying tribute to the honourable member from Walthamstow for all the work that she has undertaken in this area and for bringing this debate to the House. I believe that the result of the referendum in the Republic of Ireland has been a great victory for women's rights to make decisions about their own bodies. But it has also thrown a stark spotlight on the situation for women in Northern Ireland. It cannot, in my mind, be acceptable that in just 6 counties of this, our United Kingdom, women are forced to make long journeys, long lonely journeys across the water, or be forced into the hands of the unscrupulous and face criminal prosecutions for making decisions that should be theirs by right. And I do believe that it is time for this House to act to protect their rights, as well as the rights for everywhere else in the United Kingdom. Of course.
I very much thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. And we heard earlier from the Honourable Member for Lagan Valley about the devolution of policing issues to Northern Ireland. And I would say to the Honourable Lady, does she agree that that is part of the whole issue that is at problem here? That we are talking about policing women's bodies, and that is not the right context for this debate. This is a health matter, a medical matter, to support women making those decisions, because no woman takes this decision lightly.
Indeed, I couldn't agree with the Honourable Lady more. It is time for us to review the way that we treat this issue and to move to a medical model. Since the 1967 Act, things have changed very considerably, not just in social attitudes, but in the availability of medicines and medical terminations of pregnancy. That wasn't available at the time. We've also moved on from the very paternalistic attitudes that dictated that only 2 doctors could be trusted to help a woman make these decisions. It completely negates the role that we now have as specialist nurse practitioners in practice who undertake the role of counselling very often within these clinics. So it's an anachronism that we still insist on 2 medical signatures.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way on the matter of paternalism. Does she agree with me that comments about women having abortions as a matter of convenience are deeply offensive, and that this debate must be characterised by decency and respect? There are views across the House, but as someone who has had friends and who has supported friends who have had an abortion, nothing in what they have done or chosen to do has been about convenience.
Thank the Honourable Lady for her points, and if the House will forgive me, I'm mindful that many members wish to speak, so I won't take further interventions. But I think there's another point to make about the impact of medical terminations of pregnancy using 2 medicines. And the second of those medicines, because of the restrictions of the Act, because that currently has to be administered within the clinic, it means that women are sometimes having to face the extreme indignity of travelling home with heavy bleeding and considerable pain. It should be time for us as a House to review the way the whole of this operates and to shift to a medical model. And what I'd say to ministers is that we know that there is an opportunity to put this right with an amendment during the course of the Domestic Violence Bill. But now is the time to plan ahead for that, not to actually look the other way and to say that this is purely a devolved matter. We know that a cross-party amendment will be brought. So this is the time now to be planning ahead to look at the kind of thoughtful and careful preparations that we need to make about what the kind of medical regulations we would wish to see in place. Now, of course, there are those that say that by repealing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act, we'll be thrown into some kind of vacuum. I'm afraid that isn't the case, as the Honourable Lady opposite has already pointed out, that the term limit of 24 weeks would remain in place. But what I would say is that there are other protections there. It is already, for example, an offence to supply abortion pills under the Human Medicines Regulation Act of 2012, for example. And individuals face up to 2 years in prison and a considerable fine for supplying them in an illegal manner. Equally, for those who might turn to backstreet abortionists and have an unqualified person carry out a surgical procedure, which is what has happened in the past, we know that has happened, those who say that actually it means that there could be a free-for-all and anyone performing these kinds of procedures, well, no, that isn't the case. This would still constitute actual bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, and they wouldn't be able to rely on the victim's the consent to the procedure as a defence under Section 47 and Section 20 of the Offences Against the Person Act, which would remain in place. And this would carry a penalty of up to 5 years imprisonment and a fine. But I think the point to make here is that it's highly unlikely that anyone would want to visit a backstreet abortionist in a context where free, safe, confidential and non-stigmatising help was available free of charge on the NHS. And as many colleagues have pointed out, we don't stop abortions taking place by criminalising them and making them difficult to access. We just make them happen in a less safe context. So, as I would say to the Minister is, could I ask that they actually now start a process of preparing ahead for the inevitable cross-party amendments that are going to come forward? I hope that the Minister, in summing up, will be absolutely clear that there will be no delay to bringing forward the domestic violence bill for fear of a controversial amendment, because the amendment will be laid. But now is the time to make sure that all the regulations that we need are carefully and thoughtfully consulted upon. As my honourable friend has mentioned, it would allow devolved assemblies to also themselves decide on what was right for their areas. But I think to move now, the time is absolutely right for us to move from a situation where women are criminalised to one where women are treated with respect and dignity. I'm going to take one further intervention from my honourable colleague, the Chair of the Home Affairs Committee.
I welcome the speech that the Chair of the Health Select Committee is making, and her point that this is the opportunity to prepare and to consider these things in some detail in anticipation of future legislation. And would she agree that the moving thing about the Home to Vote movement in the Irish referendum, in the Republic referendum campaign, was that there were so many women who said they were returning home to vote so that other women didn't have to travel in future and making journeys to prevent other women having to do so.
I absolutely agree. I think we were all deeply moved by the Home to Vote campaign. And I think that, as I say, although this was in the context of the Republic of Ireland, it of course has implications for us here across the whole of the United Kingdom, because it has given us an opportunity to review what is wrong with the existing legislation. And as I say, I feel it is time for the government now to plan ahead, to have a thoughtful process of making sure that the regulations are right, and I hope that this House will decide collectively to protect and respect the rights of women wherever they live in this United Kingdom.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the aftermath of the vote in Ireland, there was a quote I saw from a woman in Northern Ireland, which was to the effect that she had the right to hold the passports of both UK and Ireland, to be a citizen of either or both, but she now didn't have the right to choose that women in either jurisdiction have. That quote was third or fourth hand by the time I saw it, but it seems to me an indicator of where many women in Northern Ireland find themselves stranded. Perhaps might be the best description of how they see their plight. Their plight is my plight, and their fight is my fight, and if they suffer, I suffer too. I stand with the women who feel themselves shorn of the rights that they see across the border in Ireland and across the Irish Sea. I wonder, though, why this should be seen as an emergency debate. The referendum in Ireland didn't change the conditions in Northern Ireland. Nothing has changed for women in Northern Ireland in terms of access to health services, except that they now have another geographically close comparison. Nothing has improved for them, nothing happily has got worse for them, but nothing has changed for them, more's the pity. Yes, this is a very sensitive issue. I think our sisters, therefore, deserve a little more consideration than a rushed debate. Who here, other than members who serve constituencies on the other side of the sea, has any real perception of the issues and possible consequences surrounding abortion in Northern Ireland? Now, I stand with my sisters in Northern Ireland, and I absolutely endorse their right to choose, but I do not claim to know their situation better than they do. I endorse their right to help shape the legislation they live under, but it is not for me or anyone else in here to tell them how to do that. Support I can offer, encouragement I will give. Legislation has to be with the agreement of the people. Government is only with the consent of the people. Now, I hear those who say this is a human rights issue. I agree. And that is why we must leave the judgment on that in the hands of the Supreme Court. That court has a duty to examine the reference from the Court of Appeal in Northern Ireland and will give guidance that must be followed. As we know, the judgment will be handed down on Thursday. We have 2 days to wait. Before I move on, I really think a little look at how Ireland approached amending its constitution would be very instructive for many in this chamber and indeed the one next door. Ireland's movement to allowing abortion to be legislated for, as has been pointed out already, that being the substance of the constitutional amendment, began with a citizens' assembly. So it was the people who had their hands on the tiller. This was no political campaign or activist-led agitation. This was people power from the start. And it should be a subject lesson for anyone who wants to effect major change. The details of the Assembly are online at citizensassembly.ie, and I would recommend a read to anyone who would like to think a little more about how nations should change direction. So Ireland is now free, as we've heard, to choose whether to legislate to allow terminations, and I understand there is legislation being drafted now. Ireland does not yet have that law in place, and the debate, as the Secretary of State mentioned, is just getting started. I note that the Taoiseach has indicated that allowing women from Northern Ireland to access those services across the border is being considered. He points out that women from Northern Ireland regularly access other health services in Ireland, and there should be no reason why any new services should be denied them. We should not, however, be thinking that Ireland's legislation is done and dusted. The drafting is not complete yet, never mind the passage of the legislation. But that legislative progression is a matter for Ireland, for the Irish people, and for the people they have elected to serve them. Likewise, the issue of abortion in Northern Ireland is a devolved matter, and it is an issue for the people of Northern Ireland and the people they elect to the Assembly. It is a matter devolved, and frankly, it matters not a jot whether the decisions made at Stormont, when it's sitting, are agreeable to members who sit here. That is the point of devolution, a point that some members of this place have been spectacularly slow to appreciate at times. That decisions in devolved administrations are taken there for reasons that people in those devolved nations understand from their point of view, and using evidence that the people and politicians and policymakers of that nation consider important. That principle stands, and it can be seen in the ways in which Scotland has led on public health issues.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. In order to allow the residents of Northern Ireland to craft their own abortion laws and so for that devolution process to be respected that she's outlined, will she be joining myself and colleagues across the House in supporting the repeal of UK legislation that prevents Northern Ireland from it? So will she support repealing 58 and 59? It would be helpful if she could be clear about that.
The points. Firstly, that OPA does not apply in Scotland, so some people seem to not be aware of that. Also, I understand that Stormont has been able to repeal those clauses itself since 2010 and apparently has chosen not to do so.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Just to clarify on that point, I think what's being missed here today is that criminal justice is a devolved matter in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Assembly has full power to repeal this in due course if that is the decision of the Northern Ireland Assembly in line with the new regulations that are put in place. This occurred under the Offences of the Person Act does not act as a barrier. That can be done in the Northern Ireland Assembly with the will of the people.
I thank the honourable member for her contribution. I would also point out that the Criminal Justice Act 1945 still prevents abortion. That's the Northern Ireland Act. Life in prison is offered for those offering abortions as well. So, that is an added complication. As we know, Stormont hasn't sat since January of last year, and I absolutely, Mr. Speaker, condemn the cowardice of the politicians who cannot give enough ground or cannot risk losing a little face to get the show back on the road and start deciding on issues that affect the people they are paid to serve. I say that because this issue has been considered at Stormont, as we've heard. The need for legislation has been agreed at Stormont, and a way forward has been laid out, as mentioned by the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke, no longer in her place. A way forward has been laid out by a working group in Northern Ireland. In a debate on consideration of a Justice Bill in February of 2016, amendments were laid which would have allowed abortions to take place in Northern Ireland in very specific circumstances, tighter than the conditions that are in place under the 1967 Act. That is absolutely true, but a movement nonetheless. And it followed, I believe, a deal of public consultation undertaken by ministers surrounding the issues of fatal fetal abnormality, incest and rape. Now, it is clear, and from what has already been said today, that from reading the transcript of that debate, that there wasn't exactly a consensus that day. The amendments were defeated, not overwhelmingly, but substantially. And one of the telling contributions that day was made by the Assembly member for South Belfast, who is now the honourable member here for Belfast South. In her speech that day, she said she was speaking on behalf of the Democratic Unionist Party on the issue, and she urged the Assembly to reject the amendments in favour of the DUP plan. So if I may quote her, the DUP is rejecting the amendment but outlining a roadmap to a sensible, informed and appropriate way forward. The Ministry of Health has been asked to establish by the end of February a working group that will include clinicians in this field and legally qualified persons to make recommendations on how this issue should be addressed. Can be addressed, including, if necessary, bringing forward draft legislation. We have asked that all interested parties should be consulted and that the group will be tasked to report within 6 months. We all need to hear more fully the views of the Royal College and others. We all need the opportunity to ask these vital questions to get the appropriate advice. That is why the working group is the best and most appropriate way forward. Now, that working group has now reported, and since the DUP is behind it, it surely has enough impetus to clear the hurdles of political impasse in Northern Ireland. The report recommended a relaxation of the restrictions on abortion, citing the general duty of the Department of Health under the Health and Personal Care Social Services Order 1972 to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of people living in Northern Ireland. The report pointed out, however, that legislative change is required for that to be done. The report is clear that the current practice results in inequality of outcomes for women in this particular patient population group when compared to the standards for treatment and care afforded to other pregnant women by Health and Social Care, as required by the Department of Health's maternity strategy, and it recommends changes in the law to allow abortions to take place. Now, the changes suggested would not go as far as the legislation here or in Scotland. Examining that wasn't the remit of the working group. It was only examining what legislative change was needed. The changes wouldn't bring legislation into line with the rights and protections we have here, and it wouldn't be the end of women having the trauma of travel to a foreign jurisdiction for health treatment. The changes would not be the changes I would like, but they are the changes which the politicians of Stormont agreed to support. We have an obligation to respect the fact that the debate on abortion has not perhaps yet been won in Northern Ireland, but this small step can be taken while the debate continues. Now, Stormont should be reconvened. It should consider legislation around abortion along with all the other responsibilities it has, but it is a devolved responsibility. Legislating here on a matter which is the responsibility of a devolved administration is invidious. And the idea that members sitting here can make decisions without any regard to the consequences is foolhardy. The Stormont has not sat for far too long, and that looks set to continue. A disgraceful abdication of responsibility on the part of elected members. Now, it isn't sitting, but it has made this decision, and there is no reason why this place shouldn't legislate to put that decision into effect. Stormont could always decide how to proceed when MLAs return to work. Legislating here for abortion in Northern Ireland without the consent of the legislature of Northern Ireland is not tenable. But consent has already been given for some change, and we front and centre. The rights of women are too often ignored and women belittled. There is a moral obligation on the politicians of Northern Ireland to get